Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar where we will be talking about leading in a crisis and how mindfulness can help. This is a very peculiar mode of interaction for me, but over the last couple of months, we've gotten used to speaking to each other virtually. So I look at all of you through this window into the world. We're going to do this fairly quickly. We have about 30 minutes with each other. So we will talk about what leadership in a crisis means and why mindfulness can help. And we'll also dip our hands a little bit into what mindfulness actually is. So for some of you who may not be familiar with the idea of mindfulness. So what is a crisis, right? So we often hear all kinds of ideas about what a crisis is, and I'm sure many of you have thought about what a crisis is. So a crisis is an intense time of difficulty requiring a decision. Okay, that will be a turning point. So the important key word here is it's a point of decision. So as much as a crisis seems like a time when people will freeze, it is a time for us to act. And a couple of days ago, I was listening to the president of NUS give a town hall where apparently the Chinese characters for crisis is it has the word opportunity and response in the character, right? So that's a very important way for leaders to think about what a crisis is. So crisis has within it the opportunity to respond. Some perspective on crisis, right? So it seems like when we are in the midst of a crisis, it can seem like this has never happened before. Okay, this is the first time and the only time that we've been in a crisis, but that's not true. The human species is fraught with many crises that we have dealt with. And it's important to keep our head when we are in the crisis to remember that we've been there before, okay? And it's happened before, yet people that you're leading and yourselves might feel this is unique. Of course, we are in the midst of perhaps one of the most important crises that we will face in our lifetimes, hopefully. Hopefully there isn't one that's bigger than this, but it's important to understand that there have been other crises in the past and the human spirit has triumphed over time, overcoming that crisis. So it's important for leaders to keep that perspective and recognize that your followers may not have that perspective. So to provide them with that mindset that this is not the only time that the mankind has ever been in a crisis, right? A crisis is distracting because you open the news, you open your WhatsApp chat, you open your email, you open this webinar, everybody's talking about a crisis. So there is, and if you look at the physiology of how we human beings respond to a crisis, we go into a state of a fight or flight response. And now when you're in a lockdown, it seems like fight is not so much of an option as much as flight. So there can be kind of a freezing response that you can get from followers. So one of the things that can happen in a crisis is that people can freeze with fear. So your role as a leader is to help people manage that fear, deal with that fear. And here, a famous quote attributed to Nelson Mandela is courage is not the absence of fear, but learning how to deal with it. So if you can learn how to deal with your fears and in the process, help your followers deal with the fears that they may be experiencing, you're providing them with courageous leadership, right? And here, the state of mind that you need to operate from in a crisis, you have two modes of operation, right? Like you could be in fear or you could be optimistic, but optimism is often not sufficient because optimism is simply a positive state of mind. You need to move from optimism to providing hope. People need to see that this crisis is here, but it will be over and there is a future that lies ahead of us, right? So it's important for leaders to provide that hope that the future, there will be a time in the future when we will be out of that crisis and we need to prepare for that time. So to look into the future and to look at, okay, so I'll come to the paradox of this. So you will have to look into the future, yet you'll have to stay present, which is really the paradox that you need to kind of resolve. A crisis also amplifies, okay? A crisis amplifies both the positive and the negative. So you cannot hide, you know. So I was just reading a quote today A crisis often doesn't show a broken system. It doesn't create a broken system. It often reveals a broken system. So if you've swept things under the carpet, there have been a certain Achilles heel for your organizations in the past. Those issues will show up. Those issues will surface in a crisis. You no longer can hide in a crisis. So a crisis amplifies. It amplifies the positive and the negative. So if you've put a lot of good systems and procedures, and if you've had really good deep interactions with your followers, that will also get accentuated in a crisis. So it accentuates both the positive and the negative, right? So what does it take to lead in a crisis? Okay. So the first thing is, as a leader, you need to learn to manage your stress. Okay. And I'll come back to this. What is stress and how do you manage stress? And that reminds me of the famous quote from Rudyard Kipling's famous poem. So you need to keep your head above water. You need to learn to manage stress. And this we know is true, not just in a crisis, but in any situation. Leaders that are very stress reactive are not often effective. So learning to manage your stress, which is high when you're a leader, right? Like it is high, it tends to peak middle management and then starts to drop a little bit, but it is still high. You need to learn to manage stress. That's a very important part of your mental hygiene to be a good leader. A crisis is an opportunity for you as a leader to focus the mind's eye on the hope, on the positive. So you can turn this adversity into opportunity. So people often look at the world and can see that the world as glass is half full or half empty. Now's the time for you as a leader to show them why the glass is half full, to turn their mind's eye into the positive rather than focusing on the negative. It requires leaders to show up in a crisis. So you may be feeling the fear, but you have to show up and you have to be vulnerable and you have to be authentic. So you cannot hide. You cannot hide behind jargon, hide behind words. So if you are feeling a certain emotion, of course, that doesn't mean radical candor, doesn't mean throwing all your emotions at your people, but you have to show up and be authentic. And as much as you need to communicate, you have to communicate judiciously. Communicating doesn't mean you communicate all the time, but you communicate enough for people to know what they need to know, but you don't do it so often that people get overwhelmed with information. So there is an optimal level of communication that can really make you effective in a crisis situation. Now, herein comes a bit of the paradox, right? So I earlier on said leadership requires you to actually provide hope and look into the future, but it also requires you to focus on the present and to deal with whatever is coming up, to say, okay, let's focus on how we will get through this lockdown period, for example, to keep people's mind's eye focused on the present, what we need to deal with here and now, and then we plan for the future. So there's a bit of a dual ambidexterity that's required. You need to focus on the present, yet think about the long term and provide hope. And there you need to hold space. So leadership is not so much tactical and strategic in these times, but it is about the space you hold for yourself and your followers to feel that they can actually get through this crisis. And this crisis is actually an opportunity for them to go ahead. Now, I want to bring a little bit here to talk a little bit about why mindfulness, right? And I've been studying this. In fact, we actually completed a research study in Wuhan in the midst of the crisis, getting people to keep a mindfulness practice to see how that impacted them, right? How does a mindfulness practice help you? One of the key resources that mindfulness provides is that it helps you manage the stress. So let's look at what is stress, right? So stress is often demands minus the resources. So there are a set of demands that your job has from the external world, and from the context and from all of the business imperatives that you have. Those create a set of demands, but you also have a set of resources. Those resources could be personal and professional. In a crisis, the demands go up dramatically, because what you often have is exceptions. You have many situations that you have not dealt with in the past. You've not planned for those events. You cannot travel. Your budgets are frozen. Your hiring is frozen. People are on furloughs. All kinds of things are happening that is increasing demands. and yet your resources are somewhat constrained professionally because you perhaps don't have your extensive network at the workplace. You don't have the benefit of the daily social interactions. You don't have the entire corporate machinery functioning at its best like it normally does. So you are actually dealing with a situation where some resources are depleted. So here, mindfulness can really help. So mindfulness is this ability or the capacity for you to be in the moment. Okay. So it's the ability for us to declutter and say, okay, all of that is happening around me, but can I now sit here, focus on what is it that I can control? What is it that I can actually pay attention to in this moment, right here, right now? So there are three dimensions to mindfulness. There is the first dimension is concentration. Concentration is this ability to not focus on the distractions that are out there, to really keep your focus, attention on whatever it is that you're paying attention to. The second is clarity. So clarity is you're able to actually declutter, you're able to actually say, okay, I'm feeling this way, I'm feeling afraid, I'm feeling fear, I'm feeling angry, or I perceive this opportunity to have that clarity of mind to actually recognize what is it that you're feeling in the moment. And the third dimension of mindfulness is equanimity. Equanimity is to respond to situations not like a stimulus response machine, but to really have that choice between stimulus and response. So, mindfulness cultivates all of these three capabilities. And it's a long practice. It takes many years to cultivate, but that doesn't mean that you have to wait for many years before you can actually reap the benefits of mindfulness. So my own research shows even a short 10-15 minute practice before tasks that we give people in the lab can provide the benefits of mindfulness. Okay, so in that spirit, what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is we're going to do a short practice. Okay, so we're going to do a short practice. So what I'm going to do now is lead you through a short mindfulness practice. So I don't know where you are, how you're watching this. You may be you may be outdoors, but hopefully not close to other people. You may be in the presence of other people. So I leave you to judge how you consume this practice. But it will be good if you can be seated. Okay, you can be seated and you can sit with your spine erect. And you can either close your eyes or half close your eyes for the rest of my instructions. So it's best if you can close your eyes and just follow my instructions. Okay, so you can just follow my instructions and just go through this practice. So just let's settle down and let's put our feet on the ground if possible. And let's either close our eyes or half close our eyes and find this space in this busy day to see if we can pause and tune into the breath. Let's take our attention to the breath. Let's take a few deep breaths. So take a deep breath in and you breathe out. Another deep breath in and breathe out completely, relaxing into this moment. Right here, right now, there's nothing else to do. There's nowhere to go. There's simply this space you're creating in the day to engage with whatever it is that you're feeling at this moment. So let's take our attention to the in breath and the out breath. Notice that your in breath is slightly shorter than your out breath. If it's not, let's make a deliberate effort to make the ratio roughly 1:2. So you breathe in and you breathe out twice as long, emptying your lungs. Let's do this practice at your own pace. Breathe in and breathe out. Notice the touch of the breath. Notice the touch of the breath against your nostrils. You're bound to get distracted. The nature of the mind is to go hither and thither. If you find that you're distracted, simply bring your attention back to the breath without judgment, without commentary, just recognizing that your mind was distracted and I just need to be back to this object of attention, which is the breath. Watching your breath like you would witness the flow of a river flowing in front of you. Nothing to do, simply observe. For those of you who have never done this before, a flurry of thoughts may come in. If that does, breathe a bit more deeply. If you breathe a bit more deeply, you realize that the distracted thoughts become less powerful. Your incoming breath energizes you. Your outgoing breath relaxes you. Continue to focus on your breath. Enjoy that stillness in the midst of your day. If you're feeling a little sleepy, it's perhaps because you're sleep deprived. Mindfulness is attention, but being relaxed. You're attentive, yet relaxed. It's also called as cool cognition. Research shows that such a state of mind can be very beneficial to your ability to make sound decisions. Coming back to the breath every time your mind wanders. A wandering mind is an unhappy mind. A focused mind is a happy mind. But this focus is not focus with effort. Over time, the focus comes with minimal effort. It's natural attention to the moment. Studies show even a 10-minute practice can lower your cortisol, the stress hormone. Take a couple of deep breaths. For those of you who have never done this before, this may feel a bit strange, but lean into that. Lean into that with curiosity. Another deep breath in, energizing your cells, and a breath out, relaxing in this moment. You may open your eyes and Just a couple more things about mindfulness. So there are a lot of ways out there to practice mindfulness. There are many apps, many, you know, you know, MP3 files that are freely available. This is no dearth of information available on mindfulness. So if you need specific recommendations, feel free to get in touch. I will provide you with specific recommendations if you need me to. So do ask me any questions you have. We have about 10 minutes left in our half an hour. I'm happy to take questions. Okay, there's one here. Okay, which leaders have shown mindful leadership during this pandemic? Which ones can improve? Okay, so I think our own leadership in Singapore has actually been remarkably mindful and remarkably present in the way they've dealt with this crisis. And without taking names or specific examples, I do think that we see great examples of mindfulness. So, for example, the one that really comes to mind, top of mind, is Salesforce and Mark Benioff, and the way they've made mindfulness very much a part of their organization. I know that from anecdotal evidence, and I think just the way they have done the messaging and responded. If I do follow them on Twitter, it's been remarkably present, remarkably attentive to the needs of the larger customer base as well as its employees. And there are many others out there that I see examples of. I do see a lot of examples of not so mindful leadership, which I won't go into for obvious reasons. But yes, we have seen great examples of mindful leadership in this time. Okay, with many people working from home, micromanagers may find managing their teams challenging. What advice do you have for team management in the current environment? That's a fantastic question. I just completed a study that looks at exactly this question. Micromanagers really are going to have a horrible time in this period, because they simply cannot micromanage, right? You're simply not going to be able to micromanage. And micromanagement comes from a lack of trust, a lack of the ability to empower and delegate. So micromanagers will have to learn to let go, because there's no other way. In fact, that's what we find. We find that micromanagers tend to actually have teams that perform poorly, even more so when people are working remotely. So asking the question, why do I micromanage? What is the deep insecurities that you feel that makes you micromanage? That's a much deeper question. It's also a potential coaching intervention for why people micromanage. But the pandemic is an absolute horrendous time for micromanagers, right? So I would create other avenues for your teams to have many-to-many communication. So tools like Slack, Microsoft Teams, many of these digital tools are very effective, so that you don't have to be the hub of all communication that's exchanged. You can create the many-to-many interactions that are required for you to get through the remote work environment effectively, right? Thank you for the example of Mandela. How would Madiba lead a nation during the current crisis today versus the current populist leaders? So one of the reasons I really admire Mandela and his leadership was his ability to look beyond the obvious echo chambers that we can belong to, right? So if you often have an identity, you can be in your echo chamber, and you don't really reach outside your echo chamber to talk to others outside your immediate network. So I think someone like Mandela, I think would have been a phenomenal leader in this time, because he wouldn't have stuck to his immediate coterie of people, would have reached across the political spectrum. What you need today is not people that will hunker down and only speak to their political spectrum, but they would reach out and unite people, because a virus is not political. It affects everyone. So this is an opportunity for us to have this common humanity that binds us, to recognize that common humanity that binds us. So, and that's happening. I think a lot of places that's happening. There is, I was just reading a paper called Catastrophe Compassion, which shows that in times of catastrophes, humanity does come together, and you do see examples of remarkable altruism. So there is hope for us, I think, so hopefully we can see more examples of that. The next question, how can organizations, leaders take their first steps towards being mindful? Is there a link between mindfulness and resilience? Absolutely. Resilience is a very deep idea. And one of the things about resilience is that resilience only gets tested when there is a crisis, right? Like when things are hunky-dory, everything is going well, the idea of resilience and grit and all of these don't really matter. It's when there is a crisis that you need that the whole resilience as a construct becomes important. Now, there are many ways to cultivate resilience. Of course, there is also evidence that some kind of trauma in the past can actually create conditions for resilience to be built. But as an intervention, I see precious little as interventions that can build resilience, and mindfulness is one of them. If you do mindfulness as an intervention in organizations to just improve employee engagement, cope with stress, that'll work to a degree. But this is an opportunity, it is a crisis. And a crisis requires a collective response. It requires a united collective response as organizations. So if you can bring collectives of people, groups of people together to actually engage together in a mindfulness practice, build that collective mindfulness. There is also this idea called team mindfulness or collective mindfulness. And we do know that collective mindfulness is even more powerful than the sum of the individual parts. So as organizations, if you can create rituals, for example, if you create like Zoom room chats where people come together and when they have a meeting, you have a mindfulness practice before you enter a meeting, that can render the meeting a lot more effective, a lot more powerful, because you've created some kind of a shared space for people to enter into. So I would recommend, utilizing this pandemic, this adversity, as an opportunity to cultivate collective mindfulness. Okay. You mentioned the research in Wuhan. Can you share some of the initial findings? What are implications for others around the world? Absolutely. So the findings are that mindfulness actually is a resource that helps people cope with the stress of the pandemic outbreak. So we tracked people for a 10-day period in the middle of the lockdown, and what we found is that the people that actually were engaging in the mindfulness practice coped much better with the information about the pandemic coming in. And how do we know we cope better? We saw that they actually slept better. And we know sleep is a very important predictor of immunity. Sleep is a very important predictor of resilience, actually, like of not resilience, but of resources. So if you sleep well, you have better resources. In fact, employees that are sleep deprived don't perform as well. I know that we wear less sleep as a badge of honor, but it's not really a good thing for you. So the implications of our findings, at least the initial implications, are it can help people sleep better, replenish themselves before they can come back to a day's work. We are doing further studies, and I will share more information as we go along of this on through our NUS platforms. I have a grant actually from NUS to study the impact of COVID-19 on the workplace, and we have a number of research projects planned around mindfulness and around other topics. So stay tuned for further information. Okay, so that's a wrap. We are almost at our time boundary. So I just want to remind you that this is an ongoing series, and we have a series of webinars lined up for you. So our next one that's coming up is how COVID-19 is transforming marketing strategies with Associate Professor Ang Swee Hoon and Ronnie Teo, MD of marketing for beer at Fraser and Neve. He's also an alumni of the NUS Business School from the class of 1992. So thank you so much for your time and your great questions. I know that this was a whirlwind of a tour into mindfulness. Hopefully this has inspired you to dig deeper. The purpose of these webinars are to make you curious, make you go and explore, and get in touch if you need further information. Thank you so much. Have a very nice rest of the day.